My name is Alexis Cole, and for 26 years, I believed I belonged somewhere. I believed that no matter what happened in this world, there was one place I could always return to. My father's house, my father's arms, my father's voice telling me that I was his daughter, and nothing would ever change that. I was wrong. Not about my father. He never stopped loving me, not for a single day. I was wrong about how far another woman would go to make sure that love never reached me after he was gone. This is the story of how my stepmother stood in a lawyer's office and watched my name get erased from my own father's will, how she smiled while she did it, and how 3 months later, that same smile disappeared from her face in that same office, because my father was smarter and more careful and loved me more than any of us understood at the time. I need to start from the beginning, because you won't understand how much this hurt unless you understand how much I had already lost by the time it happened. I was 7 years old when my mother died. Cancer, the fast kind, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare a child for the world that's about to fall on them. My father, David Cole, was 34 years old, and suddenly he was a widower and a single father, running a small but successful construction supply business in Ohio, trying to figure out how to braid hair and pack school lunches and hold a little girl while she cried herself to sleep every night for almost a year. I don't remember much about my mother now, honestly, just fragments, the smell of her lotion, her laugh in the kitchen, but I remember my father's grief clearly, because I lived inside of it with him. He never let it break either of us. That's the thing I want you to understand about my dad. He was not a soft man on the outside, quiet, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who worked with his hands and didn't say 10 words when 3 would do. But underneath that quiet exterior was the most devoted father a girl could ask for. He learned to do my hair from YouTube videos at 11 o'clock at night. He came to every single school event, sat in the front row, clapped louder than anyone else's parent. When I got my heart broken for the first time at 16, he sat on the porch with me until 2 in the morning, not saying much, just being there, handing me tissues, and eventually making pancakes because that's what he did when words failed him. He was my whole world, and for a long time, I was his. I was 19 when he met Diane. I want to be fair here, because even now, knowing everything I know, I try to be fair. When my father first introduced us, Diane seemed pleasant enough. She was polished, always put together, expensive-looking clothes on what I later learned was not an expensive income, a certain way of speaking that made her sound more educated and more refined than she actually was. She had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Brooke and Sydney, who were 14 and 12 at the time. My father had been alone for 12 years by then, and I remember feeling happy for him, genuinely happy, the first few months. He deserved companionship. He deserved not to eat dinner alone at that kitchen table every night after I left for college. I didn't see it coming, the way the ground would slowly shift under me over the next several years. Nobody ever does, I think. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small increments, small choices, small redirections of attention and money and love, until one day you look up and realize the house you grew up in doesn't feel like yours anymore. The wedding was small, just family and a few close friends, and I stood up there as my father's only child, walked him partway down before he stepped up to marry Diane, and I cried real tears, happy ones, because I thought this was a good thing. I thought I was gaining something. I had no idea I was about to start losing everything, one quiet subtraction at a time. The first thing that changed was small enough that I brushed it off. My father used to call me every single Sunday, without fail, since I'd left for college. Sunday morning calls, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes 2 hours, just talking about nothing and everything. About 6 months after the wedding, those calls started getting shorter, then less frequent. Then Diane started answering his phone sometimes, telling me he was busy, he was resting, he'd call me back. He rarely did. I told myself it was normal. New marriage, new rhythms, of course things would shift a little. I was in my last year of college, busy with my own life, and I let myself believe the excuse because the alternative was too uncomfortable to sit with. The second thing that changed was the house. I came home for Thanksgiving my senior year and found that my old bedroom, the one with my height marked in pencil on the closet doorframe, the one with the fading glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to the ceiling from when I was 12, had been converted into what Diane called a craft room. My things were in boxes in the garage, not thrown away, she was careful to say that, just organized out of the way to make space. My father apologized to me quietly in the kitchen that night, said Diane needed a space for her hobbies, said I could still stay whenever I wanted, there was a pull-out couch. I smiled and said it was fine. It wasn't fine, but I said it was. The third thing, and this one I understood even less at the time, was money. My father had always been careful with money, not stingy, but careful, the way people are when they've built something from nothing. He paid for my college mostly out of pocket, no loans, because he said he never wanted me starting my adult life already behind. After he married Diane, I started noticing small comments about how expensive I was, how much things cost, how Brooke needed a car for her 16th birthday, and wouldn't it be nice if everyone's needs were considered equally. I remember sitting at that dinner table, 21 years old, listening to Diane talk about fairness and equal treatment between children, and feeling something cold settle into my stomach, because I understood, even then, that what she meant by fairness was actually a slow redistribution of my father's attention and resources toward the family she had brought into his life, and away from me. My father never fully saw it, or maybe he saw parts of it and didn't know how to fight it without causing a war in his own home. He was a peacekeeper by nature, especially after losing my mother. I think some part of him was terrified of conflict, terrified of another loss, and Diane knew exactly how to use that fear. She never screamed. She never did anything dramatic enough for him to draw a hard line. She just quietly, patiently, over years, repositioned herself and her daughters at the center of his life, while I got pushed further and further toward the edges. By the time I was 25, I had my own apartment 2 hours away, a decent job in marketing, and a relationship with my father that had been reduced to occasional phone calls and awkward holiday visits where I felt more like a guest than a daughter. Brooke and Sydney, meanwhile, were fully entrenched. My father had paid for both of their weddings. He'd co-signed a car loan for Sydney. He'd given Brooke and her husband money for a down payment on their first house. I want to be clear, I never resented my stepsisters for receiving generosity from my father. He had a big heart, and there was room in it for many people. What I resented, what still makes my chest tighten when I think about it, was the way Diane made sure that generosity flowed one direction, while carefully, deliberately, making it harder and harder for it to flow toward me. There was a night, about a year before my father got sick, when I visited for his birthday. Diane had redecorated the entire living room. Every photo of my mother, every photo of me as a child, had been removed from the walls and replaced with photos of Diane's family, professional portraits of Brooke's wedding, Sydney's baby shower, big glossy frames everywhere. I stood in that living room, in the house I grew up in, and I could not find a single trace that I had ever existed there. I didn't say anything. I smiled, ate cake, sang happy birthday, and drove 2 hours home crying the entire way. I called my father a week later, and for the first time in years, I tried to actually talk to him about how I felt. I chose my words carefully because I didn't want to force him to choose between his wife and his daughter. I just wanted him to see me, to acknowledge what was happening. He listened. He got quiet, the way he always did when something hurt him, and then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, "Lexi, you will always be my daughter. Nothing anyone does can change that. I promise you, when it matters, you'll understand how much you mean to me." At the time, I thought he meant it emotionally. I had no idea he meant it literally, that he was already, quietly, taking steps to make sure that promise couldn't be erased by anyone, no matter what happened after he was gone. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 11 months later. I won't spend too much time on this part, because it's still the hardest part for me to speak about, even now. It was fast. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. 4 months from diagnosis to the day he died. I moved back to Ohio for those 4 months, took a leave from my job, slept most nights in a chair beside his hospital bed, later beside his bed at home during hospice care. Diane was there too, of course, and to her credit, During those 4 months, she showed real grief. Whatever else she was, whatever else I would learn about her, I don't doubt that some part of her did love my father. That complicated things for me afterward, honestly. It's easier to hate someone who is purely a villain. It's harder when they're capable of real feeling and real cruelty at the same time. There was one afternoon near the end when Diane had gone home to shower and change, and it was just me and my father in that quiet bedroom, machines humming softly, autumn light coming through the blinds. He was weak, but lucid. He held my hand and told me he was proud of me. He told me he was sorry for the years he let slip away, for not fighting harder to protect our closeness, for letting the house become a place where I didn't feel like I belonged anymore. I told him it was okay, that I understood, that I loved him no matter what. And he squeezed my hand and said, "I've made sure you'll be taken care of. I need you to trust me on that. Whatever happens after, however things look at first, trust me, Lexi. I never stopped protecting you." I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was talking about an insurance policy, maybe some savings. I had no idea he was talking about something far more deliberate. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, with me holding one hand and Diane holding the other. I won't pretend that moment wasn't its own kind of sacred. The two of us united in that final loss, whatever had come before it. For about a week after the funeral, there was a strange, exhausted truce between Diane and me. We were both grieving. We both loved him. It felt, briefly, like maybe we could find our way to something like family after all. That truce ended in a law office 3 weeks later. The will reading was scheduled on a Thursday afternoon. My father's attorney, a man named Gerald Whitfield who had handled his business and personal affairs for almost 20 years, called everyone together, me, Diane, Brooke, Sydney, and Sydney's husband, who came along for reasons I still don't fully understand, except that Diane seemed to want a show of numbers in that room. I remember exactly what I was wearing, a black dress I'd bought for the funeral and hadn't taken off since, it felt like. I remember the smell of the office, old paper and coffee. I remember sitting in a chair slightly apart from the rest of them, because even in that room, even in that moment, there was a physical distance between me and the family Diane had built. Gerald Whitfield opened a folder and began reading through the will in that flat, professional voice attorneys use, the tone that makes life-altering sentences sound like grocery lists. The house, in full, to Diane Cole. The contents of the primary checking and savings accounts, to Diane Cole. A vacation property on the lake, to Diane Cole. $25,000 each to Brooke and Sydney, described in the document as beloved daughters. The business, my father's company, the one he had built from a single truck and a rented warehouse into a business worth well over $1 million, was to be liquidated, with proceeds split between Diane and her 2 daughters. My name was not mentioned once. I sat very still. I remember my ears ringing, the way they do when your body understands something before your mind fully catches up. I looked at Gerald Whitfield, waiting for him to correct himself, to say he'd skipped a page, to say there was some clause about David's daughter Alexis that he simply hadn't reached yet. He closed the folder instead. He looked, I noticed, deeply uncomfortable, his eyes flicking toward me with something that looked almost like an apology, though he said nothing. Diane spoke first. She said, very smoothly, very rehearsed, that David had explained this arrangement to her before he passed, that he wanted the estate to remain intact for the family, that he trusted Diane to make sure everyone was taken care of fairly over time, that this was simply how he wanted things structured for tax purposes. Brooke nodded along like she'd heard this speech before. Sydney wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, why my name wasn't in the will at all. Not even a token amount. Not even a keepsake. Nothing. Diane's answer, and I remember this word for word because it replayed in my head for weeks afterward, was this. David and I discussed it. He felt you'd already received your share when he paid for your college. He wanted the rest to go toward the family that was actually here, taking care of him, day to day. I know that's hard to hear, sweetheart, but that was his decision. I want to tell you I stood up and fought back right then, said something powerful and cutting that put her in her place. I didn't. I sat there in that chair, in that black funeral dress, and I felt something inside me quietly shatter. Not just grief for my father, I had already been grieving him for months, but a different kind of grief. The grief of realizing that the last word on my relationship with my own father, at least as far as the paperwork said, was that I didn't matter enough to be remembered. I left that office without saying much else. Gerald Whitfield walked me to the elevator, and just before the doors closed, he said something odd, something I turned over in my mind for weeks. He said, "Alexis, give me a call next week. There's something we should discuss privately." I nodded, barely registering it through the fog I was in, and went home to my apartment 2 hours away and cried for 3 days straight. I didn't call Gerald Whitfield the next week. I'll be honest with you, I didn't call him for almost a month. I was too raw, too humiliated, too busy trying to hold together the pieces of a life that suddenly felt like it had never had solid ground beneath it. I threw myself into work. I stopped answering calls from Diane's number when she occasionally tried to check in, always with that same falsely sweet tone, always managing to work in some comment about how everyone processes grief differently, as though my anger were simply a stage I needed to move through, rather than a completely rational response to being erased from my father's final wishes. It was actually my best friend, Priya, who pushed me to finally return Gerald's call. She'd been staying with me on weekends, watching me spiral, watching me question every memory I had of my father, wondering if the man I thought loved me unconditionally had actually, quietly, decided I wasn't worth remembering in the end. Priya sat me down one Sunday morning with 2 cups of coffee and said, "Lex, that lawyer wanted to talk to you privately. That's not normal. Lawyers don't ask to talk to disinherited children unless there's a reason. Call him." So I did. Gerald Whitfield's office called me back that same afternoon and asked if I could come in the following Tuesday. I drove the 2 hours back to Ohio with my stomach in knots the entire way, half convinced this was going to be some final formality, some paperwork closing out my father's affairs, nothing more. I remember sitting in the waiting room of his office, and it looked different this time, quieter, none of the tension of the family gathering weeks earlier. Gerald invited me into his private office alone this time, no Diane, no stepsisters, and closed the door behind us. He sat across from me, took off his glasses, and said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, "Alexis, I need to explain something to you, and I need you to understand that everything I did was at your father's explicit, written instruction." He reached into a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a second envelope. It was sealed, my name written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting, the same handwriting from the birthday cards he'd written me every year since I was 7 years old. Gerald explained that 18 months before my father passed away, well before his diagnosis, well before any of us knew he was sick, my father had come to him privately, without Diane's knowledge, and restructured a significant portion of his estate. He explained that my father had grown increasingly concerned over the previous several years about the dynamics in his household, about the way Diane had positioned her daughters and slowly marginalized me, and that he wanted to protect certain assets in a way that could not be touched, altered, or contested by Diane, no matter what pressure she might apply to him while he was alive, and no matter what she might attempt after he was gone. What my father had done, Gerald explained, was create a separate trust, entirely outside of the will that had been read publicly weeks earlier. The house, the checking accounts, the lake property, even the eventual liquidation of company assets outlined in that public will. All of it was real. All of it was legally binding, and all of it would go to Diane and her daughters exactly as stated. My father had never intended to fight Diane over those things. He'd told Gerald, in a conversation Gerald now shared with me almost word for word, that he didn't want his final years to be consumed by conflict, that he'd rather give Diane peace of mind about the house and the money she cared about, and instead protect the one thing that actually mattered to him in a way she could never touch or manipulate. That one thing was the business itself, not its liquidation value, but the business as a living, operating entity, along with a separate holding account my father had been quietly building for almost a decade, funded by profits he'd redirected from the company before Diane ever had visibility into the full financial picture. The public will spoke of liquidating the business and splitting proceeds, But what none of them knew, what had never been disclosed to Diane because it fell entirely outside the will's jurisdiction, was that my father had already transferred majority ownership of the company into an irrevocable trust 18 months earlier, with me as the sole beneficiary. There was nothing left inside the business itself for Diane to liquidate. The shell that remained in the estate was a fraction of its former value, because the real value, the operating contracts, the client relationships, the equipment, the commercial property the warehouse sat on, had already been legally transferred out of his personal estate and into a trust that no will, no matter how it was read in a public room full of stepdaughters, could touch. Alongside that, the second envelope contained the holding account, nearly $400,000, built quietly over almost 10 years, along with a handwritten letter from my father that Gerald had been instructed to deliver only after I had personally reached back out to him, because my father, in his infinite understanding of who I was, predicted exactly how I would react to that will reading. He predicted I would be devastated, that I would withdraw, that I would need time before I was ready to hear anything else. He told Gerald not to chase me down with this information. He wanted me to come to it on my own timing, in my own grief, without anyone pressuring me. He said, according to Gerald, if she's anything like her mother, she'll need space before she's ready for anything more. Let her have that. It'll still be there when she's ready. I sat in that office and read my father's letter with my hands shaking so badly, Gerald eventually had to hold the pages steady for me. I won't share every word of it. Some things are too personal even now, but I'll tell you the parts that changed everything for me. He wrote that he had watched, over the years, exactly what I had watched: the slow redistribution of attention and resources, the erasure of my presence from the walls of our home, the way Diane worked to make sure her daughters were seen and celebrated while I quietly faded into the background of my own family. He wrote that he was ashamed of how long it took him to see it clearly, and even more ashamed of how long it took him to act. He wrote that he loved Diane, in his own complicated way, and that he genuinely didn't want to spend his final years in open war with her, especially once he got sick and simply didn't have the strength for that kind of conflict. But he wrote that his love for her did not erase his responsibility to me, and that he had made a decision. He would give her peace in the house and the money she valued so much, because material things had always meant more to her than they meant to him, but he would protect, absolutely and irrevocably, the one part of his legacy that represented everything he had actually built with his own two hands, and he would make sure it went to the one person who had actually understood the meaning behind that work. He wrote that the public will reading would hurt me. He knew it would. He apologized for that, more than once in the letter, said he'd gone back and forth about whether to warn me beforehand, and ultimately decided against it, because he was afraid that if Diane sensed anything was wrong, if she suspected there was a second layer to his estate planning, she might find some way to contest the trust before he passed, might make his final months a legal battle, instead of whatever peace they could still find together. He asked me to forgive him for putting me through that public humiliation, and he asked me to understand that it was, in his mind, the price of making sure what happened next couldn't be touched, couldn't be argued with, couldn't be taken from me the way so many smaller things already had been. And then, near the end of the letter, he wrote the words that I think about more than anything else, the words I have read probably 300 times since that day in Gerald's office. He wrote, "Lexi, you were never erased. You were protected. There's a difference, even if it didn't feel that way in that room. I made sure of it the only way I knew how, quietly, the way I've always tried to take care of you. The house was never really yours to lose, sweetheart. That was Diane's world, and I let her have it because I knew where your real inheritance was always going to be. It's in the business, in the hands you learned to work with because you used to sit in my office as a little girl, asking me to teach you everything. It's in the account I built for you every single time the company had a good quarter, dreaming about the day you'd need it. And it's in every year I got to be your father, which honestly was worth more to me than anything I'm leaving behind. Don't let this fight with Diane become the story of your life. Take what I've given you, build something with it, and remember that whatever happened in that house those last years, you were never, for one single day, anything less than my daughter, and my whole heart." I cried in Gerald Whitfield's office for almost an hour. He let me, He told me afterward that he had known my father for almost 20 years, had watched him build that company from nothing, and that in all that time, he had never seen a man think as carefully, as strategically, about protecting someone he loved. He said my father had visited his office more than a dozen times over that final 18 months, always alone, always careful, refining the trust documents, making absolutely certain there would be no legal ambiguity Diane could exploit. What happened next took a few more months to fully unfold. Once the trust was activated and I officially took control of the business, along with the operating assets that had never actually belonged to the estate Diane inherited, the truth became impossible to hide. Diane's attorney, because of course she hired one the moment she understood what had happened, attempted to challenge the trust, arguing it had been created under undue influence, or that my father lacked capacity, or any number of things attorneys reach for when they're grasping. Gerald had anticipated every single one of those arguments. My father had undergone a formal capacity evaluation at the time the trust was created, 18 months before his diagnosis, specifically so no one could later claim he wasn't of sound mind. Every meeting had been documented, every decision had been made with Gerald present, with careful notes, with my father speaking clearly and consistently about his reasoning. The trust held. It held completely, and after nearly 4 months of legal posturing that cost Diane a significant portion of the cash she'd inherited from the will, her attorney advised her to drop the challenge entirely, because she had no realistic chance of winning. I want to tell you honestly, this part of the story doesn't end with some triumphant scene where I confronted Diane in that same law office, where I stood up and delivered some perfect speech about karma and justice while she wept and apologized. That's not what happened, and I think real life rarely gives you that kind of clean resolution. What actually happened was quieter and, in its own way, sadder. Diane and I have not spoken since the legal challenge was dropped. Brooke sent me one strange, guilt-laden text message about 6 months later, saying she was sorry for how things turned out, without ever quite acknowledging what her mother had actually done, and I didn't respond, because I honestly didn't know what there was left to say to any of them. I took over my father's company at 26 years old, terrified, grieving, and completely unprepared in some ways, and completely prepared in others, because he had spent my entire childhood teaching me things I didn't even realize were an apprenticeship at the time. I remembered him showing me how to read a balance sheet when I was 14, thinking it was boring, having no idea he was quietly building toward this moment. I remembered him bringing me to job sites on weekends, introducing me to his crew, letting me shadow the office manager during summers, never explicitly saying why, just saying he wanted me to understand where our life came from. It has been almost 2 years now since my father died, since that will reading, since the second envelope changed the entire trajectory of my life. The business is still standing, actually growing, because I refused to let it become a monument to grief. I turned it into something alive instead, the way he would have wanted. I kept most of his original crew, several of whom have been with the company for over 15 years, and cried when they found out I was taking over, told me stories about my father I'd never heard before, stories about the young widower who used to bring his little girl to the warehouse on Saturdays because he couldn't afford a babysitter and didn't trust anyone else to watch her anyway. I still think about that room, the will reading, more often than I'd like to admit. I think about sitting in that chair while Diane explained, so smoothly, so confidently, that I had already gotten my share, that the rest belonged to the family that was actually there. I think about how certain she seemed, how rehearsed, and I wonder now whether some part of her actually believed she had won something that day, whether she walked out of that office feeling like she'd successfully closed the door on me for good. I wonder if she has any idea, even now, that my father had been 3 steps ahead of her for almost a decade, quietly building a door she never even knew existed, on the other side of the one she thought she'd shut. I don't say any of this with hatred anymore, or at least, not the raw, burning hatred I felt in the months right after that reading. I've done a lot of work to get to a calmer place with it. Therapy, time, the slow process of understanding that Diane's actions, cruel as they were, ultimately said more about her own fears and insecurities than they ever said about my worth as a daughter. I think she spent years terrified that my father's love for me was a threat to her own family's security, And instead of trusting that love could simply expand to include everyone, she tried to contract it, to squeeze me out, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of me in that house. She never understood that my father's love wasn't a finite resource she needed to protect her daughters from. She never understood that trying to erase me would only reveal, in the end, exactly how much he had always been paying attention. What I hold on to now, more than the business, more than the money in that account he built for me one good quarter at a time, is the letter. I've had it framed, actually, tucked inside a drawer where I can pull it out when I need to hear his voice again. Not displayed on a wall, because some things are too private for that, but close, always close. I read it on hard days, on the anniversary of his death, on random Tuesday afternoons when the weight of running the company he built feels like more than I can carry. I read the part where he calls it my real inheritance, and I understand now that he wasn't talking about the trust or the money at all. He was talking about the discipline, the patience, the willingness to sit quietly for years, planning, protecting, refusing to let anyone's cruelty become the final word on how he cared for me. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt erased by someone in your own family, pushed to the margins while someone else was moved to the center, I want you to hear something my father taught me, even if it took his death for the lesson to fully land. Sometimes the people who love us most aren't the loudest about it. Sometimes they're working quietly, in ways we can't see yet, to make sure that whatever happens, whatever unfair rooms we're forced to sit in, whatever cold words are spoken about our worth, there's a second envelope somewhere, waiting for the right moment to tell the truth. I got mine. I hope, in whatever way applies to your own life, you find yours too. My father died believing I would understand, eventually, that I had never actually been erased at all. It just took a second envelope, read in a quiet office weeks later, for me to finally believe it myself.